Before you lies a yellowed sheet of parchment, dated November 22nd, 1736. This is neither a scientific treatise nor a personal letter, but a strict financial report, certified by the seal of the Paris city magistrate. In the expenses column, it records payment for services in delivering 3 units of anatomical material from the Châtelet prison, 30 livres for transportation, 12 livres for the purchase of pine shavings and aromatic essences, 8 livres for overtime work by the guards. This document is the key to understanding how the state machinery of the 18th century transformed the procedure of dissection into a complex mechanism of social control and an exquisite spectacle for the elite. Before we proceed to a detailed reconstruction of how flesh was turned into political capital, I ask you to subscribe to our channel to support the development of documentary historical research and help us in the search for new archival evidence. To understand the institutional basis of 18th century anatomical theaters, it is necessary to analyze the legal status of the human body during that period. By the beginning of 1701, the medieval notion of the inviolability of remains had finally given way to state pragmatism. From the perspective of jurisprudence at the time, the body of a criminal, after the pronouncement of sentence, ceased to belong to him or his family. It became the property of the crown. This was the highest form of confiscation of property, where the property consisted of muscles, bones, and internal organs. In this context, the anatomical theater was not a temple of science in the modern sense. It was a place of final fixation of state power over the subject. According to the royal decree of 1752, issued in Britain and known as the Murder Act, dissection was appointed by the court as an additional punishment intended to intensify the shame of cessation of existence. The body was not simply deprived of life, it was deprived of the right to burial, which, in the coordinate system of that time, meant the civil and religious erasure of the personality. The social composition of participants in these events was strictly regulated. On the lower tiers, in immediate proximity to the dissection table, sat professors of medicine and licensed surgeons. The middle tiers were occupied by students and representatives of the nobility who had purchased tickets. The upper galleries were intended for a broader public, including wealthy merchants and officials. The cost of an entrance ticket to the Leiden Anatomical Theatre in the mid-18th century was about 15 stuvers, a substantial sum comparable to the weekly earnings of a qualified craftsman. This ensured a strict property qualification and turned dissection into a closed club act. The archives preserve lists of invitees to the dissection of a notorious criminal in 1720 in Berlin, among whom are listed high-ranking officials and even ladies from the Prussian court retinue. For them, it was a form of political triumph of order over chaos, embodied in the body of the executed. The mechanics of operating such a structure required intricate logistics. The problem of supplying material was extremely acute, as the legal influx of bodies from executed criminals did not cover the growing demands of the academies. In response to this shortage, a shadowy but institutionally embedded system of intermediaries emerged, known as resurrectors. According to the protocols of the London police from 1776, there were stable groups consisting of former gravediggers, apothecaries' assistants, and dock laborers. They operated under direct contracts with anatomical schools. Orders were transmitted through encrypted notes, in which bodies were referred to as goods or logs. The oaths sworn by participants in such groups differed little from the pledges of past secret heretical societies. Disclosure of the storage location of the goods or the names of buyers was punishable by immediate physical suppression at the hands of the group itself. Meeting locations and timings were strictly observed. Dissections were conducted primarily during the cold season, from October to March, to slow the process of tissue decomposition in the absence of refrigeration facilities. Each session in the anatomical theater was precisely timed. According to the regulations of the Paris Academy of Sciences from 1708, the first day was devoted to the abdominal organs, the second to the thoracic cavity, and the third to the head and limbs. The audience was changed during short breaks, when the room was fumigated with juniper and lavender to neutralize odors. This detail of the conspirators' daily life in the name of science shows that the comfort of high-ranking spectators ranked alongside educational objectives. A critical audit of the system's functioning in the mid-18th century reveals a number of systemic contradictions that often led to logistical failures. The main risk was the leakage of information about the origin of the bodies. In 1749, mass riots broke out in Edinburgh when a crowd discovered that a person whose existence had ended not as a result of a judicial sentence, but from natural causes, had been delivered to the university for dissection, after which his grave was desecrated. Official reports from the magistrate attempted to present this as an accidental misunderstanding, but a comparison of the university's financial ledgers with records from the Greyfriars churchyard shows that the purchase of bodies from unidentified paupers was a regular practice, concealed under the guise of donations for scientific needs. In this regard, we see a direct contradiction between the testimonies of university archives, which assert the legality of every procedure, and police protocols that document instances of bribing cemetery guards. The architecture of anatomical theaters itself served as a tool for encryption and information transmission. The buildings were designed to minimize contact between spectators and the process of preparing the material. There were secret staircases and hidden hatches through which corpses were delivered directly to the table from underground chambers. In the University of Padua, the theater's construction allowed the dissection table to be completely concealed in the event of a sudden inspection by church authorities, although by the mid-18th century, such measures were more a nod to tradition than a real necessity. Nevertheless, this seclusion created an aura of initiates around the anatomists, who possessed the right to physically suppress the mystery of death. The financial flows behind the organization of anatomical festivals impress with their detail. There existed a complex system for distributing revenue from ticket sales. A portion of the sum went to the university fund, another part to the professor-demonstrator, and a significant share was spent on compensating the services of the city executioner. The executioner in this system was a key link, a logistical operator who ensured the timely delivery of material in proper condition. Documents from Nuremberg for the year 1743 record a conflict between the Surgeons' Guild and the city executioner due to the latter damaging internal organs in the process of depriving the criminal of life, which reduced the demonstrative value of the object. This testifies to a purely commercial, desecrated approach to the procedure. A critical analysis of sources from the 1770s reveals that many scientific reports of the time were deeply biased. Professors seeking funding from monarchs often attributed to themselves discoveries made during public dissections, which in reality were purely formal in nature. Comparing students' personal diaries with official publications of academies uncovers that the majority of spectators came not for anatomical knowledge, but for social confirmation of their status. Attendance at the dissection of a notorious conspirator or political opponent was an act of symbolic complicity in his final elimination. By the beginning of the 19th century, the structure of anatomical theaters began to undergo changes, driven by both progress in tissue preservation and shifts in the legal framework. The Anatomy Act of 1832 in the United Kingdom legalized the transfer to science of the bodies of all who died in public institutions and were not claimed by relatives, which effectively ended the market for resurrectionists. However, the archives of the 18th century have preserved for us a detailed picture of an era when knowledge of the body was inextricably linked to the state's right to violence. In the epilogue of this investigation, it is worth turning to the inventories of property seized from anatomical theaters after their reorganization into more closed laboratories. The lists include hundreds of wax models, a collection of dry preparations, and silver instruments, often adorned with the coats of arms of noble patrons. The archives of anatomical societies were partially destroyed during wars and revolutions, but surviving diplomatic correspondence testifies that the exchange of anatomical secrets between the courts of Europe was an important part of behind-the-scenes politics. The influence of these events on the legal system was colossal. It was in the 18th century that modern concepts of forensic medical expertise and human rights, or their absence, to one's own body after its cessation formed. Analysis of these documents allows us to assert that anatomical theaters were not merely places of entertainment for the nobility, but powerful instruments of disciplinary society, where the surgeon's scalpel completed the work begun by the sword of justice. Continuing the study of the institutional foundations of 18th-century medicine, it is necessary to pay close attention to the system of personnel training within these closed structures. Anatomy education from 1720 to 1780 was not an open educational process. It was built on the principles of rigid hierarchy and a system of personal patronage. To gain access to the dissection hall not as a spectator, but as an assistant, a candidate had to undergo a procedure reminiscent of initiation into a secret society. According to the statutes of the Vienna Medical School in the mid-century, the assistant took an oath not to disclose dissection methods and, more importantly, the sources of body procurement. In conditions where a significant portion of the material came through illegal channels, silence was a condition for the survival of the entire institution. The logistics of transporting bodies within cities also deserves a detailed analysis. This was a secret operation, requiring the participation of numerous individuals. For example, in Paris in 1765, there operated a well-established network that included drivers of special closed carriages, which had the right to travel through the city during curfew hours. According to preserved invoices, these carriages were often disguised as vehicles for transporting foodstuffs or fabrics. In the event of a stop by a patrol, the coachman presented a permit signed by the chief of city police. This indicates that the highest leadership of law enforcement agencies was fully aware of the anatomists' activities and patronized them, understanding the necessity of medical research for the needs of the Army and Navy. Here we see how the interests of science, state security, and organized crime intertwined into a single functional node. The financial audit of the resurrectionists' system is also interesting. In London, in the 1790s, there existed the so-called Anatomical Club, which was essentially a cartel. Club members set fixed prices for bodies, depending on their condition and age. In documents found in the basements of the old building of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, there are records of payments of bonuses for bodies of people with rare pathologies. This turned death into an auction. If a person had an unusual physical build during life, a real hunt for their body began even before the moment of their actual cessation of existence. Preserved letters show anatomists negotiating with corrupt prison doctors to be informed of a specific prisoner's death several hours before their relatives were notified. This was a cynical and effective system for intercepting information. A critical analysis of sources concerning the daily life of spectators in anatomical theaters allows us to dispel the myth that these were exclusively enlightened people. Analyzing catering bills found in the Leiden archives for 1748, we see huge purchases of wine, delicacies, and high-quality wax candles. Dissections were often accompanied by music. In some theaters, there were special boxes for the orchestra. This turned the act of dissection into a kind of opera, where the deprivation of a criminal's life served only as a prelude to a social performance. The professor anatomist in this system acted not only as a scientist, but also as a director managing the audience's emotions. His rhetoric, recorded in printed lectures of that time, was filled with references to the grandeur of the state order capable of comprehending and systematizing even death itself. The influence of this practice on the legal system of 18th-century Europe was multifaceted. First, it led to a revision of death confirmation procedures. The fear of being buried alive, or worse, ending up on an anatomist's table in a state of coma, forced lawyers and doctors to develop clearer criteria for cessation of existence. Instructions appeared prescribing to wait a certain number of hours before handing over the body to the academy. Second, a new branch of law emerged regulating ownership of remains. Until that moment, the law had practically not considered the corpse as an object of civil rights. Conflicts between the families of the deceased and anatomical schools forced courts to issue decisions that formed the basis of modern bioethical legislation, although at that time they protected rather the interests of the state and science than the individual. Analysis of betrayals and leaks within the system of anatomical theaters reveals that the majority of failures were linked to the financial dishonesty of intermediaries. In 1782, a scandal erupted in Bologna when it came to light that one of the theater's attendants was selling body parts from local paupers to producers of amulets and dubious medicinal remedies. This investigation, whose protocols spanned more than 400 pages, exposed an entire network of illegal trafficking in biological materials that extended far beyond scientific purposes. The prosecution insisted that such actions undermined the authority of the state, turning an instrument of public education into a source of personal gain. The attendant was subjected to physical suppression, and the archives pertaining to this part of the case were classified for decades. The documentary epilogue to the existence of anatomical theaters as venues for mass spectacles is tied to a shift in societal sensibilities at the turn of the 19th century. The rise of humanistic ideas and changing attitudes toward death rendered public dissections unacceptable to the new bourgeois morality. Yet the archives accumulated over years of these theaters' operations became the foundation for modern medicine. The inventory of confiscated property from one of the Parisian academies following its reorganization in 1803 included thousands of detailed drawings, hundreds of specimens preserved in formaldehyde, and an extensive library of dissection protocols, each essentially a document chronicling the cessation of a specific individual's existence in the name of collective knowledge. These archives today serve as an invaluable resource not only for historians of medicine, but also for researchers of political technologies. For the anatomical theater was a place where power, in the most literal sense, took a person apart, piece by piece, to understand how they were structured and how best to govern them. By examining financial reports and visitor logs, one can even reconstruct the weather conditions and atmosphere of those days. For instance, in January 1731, Amsterdam was gripped by anomalous frosts, which enabled a record-breaking series of dissections lasting 12 days straight. The records note an increased expenditure on coal for heating the spectator areas while maintaining icy temperatures in the working zone. This temperature contrast serves as a metaphor for the 18th century itself. The icy rationalism of scientific inquiry combined with the public's hot fascination with the spectacle of death. It is also important to note the role of the Church in this system. Contrary to the widespread notion of conflict between faith and science, the documents attest to pragmatic cooperation. In Rome during the 1770s, dissections were conducted with official approval from the papal administration, on the condition that the extracted organs would not be used for blasphemous rituals and would be buried after the lecture cycle concluded. In practice, this meant that the Church delegated to the state the right to dispose of the bodies of sinners, while retaining formal oversight of the salvation of their souls. It was a complex compromise in which theological arguments were tailored to the political necessity of training qualified physicians. Thus, the anatomical theater of the 18th century emerges before us as the most intricate socio-political institution. It was not merely a room with a table in the center, but a nexus of interests involving the monarchy, the judiciary, science, and the black market. Studying this topic through paleographic methods and archival research allows us to discern, amid the mystical fog of the past, the clear contours of a bureaucratic machine that exploited death as a resource to bolster the foundations of enlightened absolutism. Each entry on the purchase of thread for sewing up cadavers or bills for laundering prosectors' smocks bears witness to how the modern world was forged, in which the human body became the ultimate object of intense state surveillance and scientific analysis. Summing up this technical audit of one of the most specific aspects of 18th century life, we see that the anatomical boom was caused not by a sudden surge of curiosity about biology, but by profound transformations in the structure of power. The state required a healthy population for waging wars and developing manufactures, which meant that medicine had to become an exact science. For this, material was needed, and the state ensured its supply through the system of criminal law. The noble spectators filling the theater stands were not just idle observers, they were witnesses to the triumph of the rational method, which was now applied not only to stars or minerals, but to human flesh itself. The archives have preserved the names of those who lay on the tables and those who held the scalpel. And today, we can restore this history in all its documentary completeness, without embellishments and unnecessary speculations. It was an era when the theater ceased to be a place of fiction and became a place of ultimate biological truth. In conclusion, it should be noted that the fate of many anatomical theaters turned out to be lamentable. With the development of clinical medicine and the transition of training directly to hospitals, these magnificent amphitheaters were abandoned or converted into warehouses and lecture halls. However, their influence on the architecture of modern operating rooms and lecture halls is indisputable. The lighting system, acoustics, seating arrangement, All this was worked out in the 18th century during those very entertaining dissections. The legal legacy of this era also continues to live in modern codes, reminding us of the times when the boundaries between science, spectacle, and state coercion were practically erased. Careful study of protocols and financial records of the past allows us not only to reconstruct the daily life and morals of that era, but also to better understand the mechanisms of power operation, which, despite the change of centuries, remain unchanged in their essence. Control, systematization, and the transformation of any process, even the most frightening, into a tool for maintaining the established order. Every word in the old documents, every number written out in words in our research serves as confirmation that history is not a set of legends, but a clear sequence of actions recorded on paper and awaiting its careful researcher. With this, we conclude our deep immersion into the anatomy of power in the 18th century. We have reconstructed the chain of events from the pronouncement of the sentence to the last stitch on the body, analyzed the logistics of the black market and the financial strategies of universities. This study once again proves that behind any fashion or entertainment of the past, there always lie rigid institutional interests and the dry pragmatism of governance. Truth is always hidden in financial books and secret orders, and our task as historians is to bring it to light, whatever it may be. I hope that this archaeology of power has helped you to look at the Age of Enlightenment in a new way and appreciate the colossal work of systematizing the world that was done by our predecessors. Your support in the form of subscriptions and interest in such topics allows us to continue this complex work in the archives, bringing back from oblivion facts that shape our understanding of the present. The historical process is continuous, and every detail, every name in the list of confiscated property is another brick in the building of our collective memory. Be critical of sources,